Hey, what's up, you guys? John here. The real estate market is getting obliterated in Los Angeles and New York City, and it's just begun. And these two areas specifically are the exception to the rule because they're so unique in their policies, politics, and what's happening in these overall locations. I see a huge crash coming. In this video, I'm going to give you 8 reasons why I think the crash in these two segments are going to be especially bad compared to many other locations. So without further ado, let's begin. Please smash that like button. Let YouTube know that you like to see more real estate content. Drop your comments below, and if you're a new subscriber, drop it in the comment section and I'll personally welcome you to the channel. All right guys, let's begin. So we're going to start backwards and start at number 8. So the 8th reason is affordability. In Manhattan, living in Manhattan, it's 148% higher than the average of anywhere else to live in the country. So expensive. And Los Angeles, the average 1-bedroom apartment is $2,100, and the average utilities is about almost $150. And that's simply just for a roof over your head. And this affordability is going to get worse and worse as jobs start tightening up and people become much more careful with how they're spending their money. Number 7 is a 2-word disaster to hit real estate in LA and New York City, and those 2 words are rent control. And what this is in summary is if you sign a 1-year lease with a tenant in either of those locations, and at the end of the year you want the tenant to move out, and that tenant says, you know what, I'm just going to stay, they're going to stay forever. So they can stay literally for 20 years or 50 years or however long they want. And so ultimately, if you sign a lease in 1990 with a tenant at, say, $800 per month, and rent's increasing a lot faster than what you're allowed to increase rent at, because there's a fixed percentage you're allowed to increase rent at in both locations, and it changes yearly, over time, the discrepancy in rent becomes huge, massive. I mean, it could be $800 for 1-bedroom apartment in New York City in, say, 1995. And then 2020, it could be $3,500. So that difference of almost, $2,700 is going to be reflected into the overall value of the property. And then what happens, which gets bad for everyone, is that property taxes become lower because the building's making less money. And then since property taxes are becoming lower, the city gets less funding for schools, police departments, street services, government jobs, all these things. And then on top of that, you're incentivizing people to stay in these units and taking away housing stock from everyone else that wants to be in those units. So then whatever is left, the supply and demand. If there's only so much housing and everyone's fighting for it, it's just going to take pricing so high. But if it was a free market like it is at, Shell gas station or Whole Foods, where the market determines the price, then ultimately what's going to happen is I think rents would come down in these 2 areas. In these 2 markets, the policy, the government, the people, everyone is holding up these signs, housing is a human right. And if you go to Texas or Florida or Ohio or anywhere else, people just know that no, nothing is a human right. Everyone has to work for, for housing, for food, for things. And that's the way that the world works. And those 2 areas are a little bit different. And I think it's scaring a lot of investors right now when they're looking at what's happening. They see changes coming politically. They see jobs are providing less high-paying opportunities to tenants. They see this and it's making them question, what should I do next? Should I stay? Should I really stay in New York? And they're making new rent control laws. They just passed a series of aggressive rent control measures in New York City just last year. It's a really big issue for property owners in these 2 areas because since the politicians aren't on their side, they're taking a side. They're taking a side for the tenant and not taking a side for what's right. And the reason that they do this is because they don't want to take on the responsibility of all these tenants. So they essentially push the responsibility onto the landlord and say, you know what, do as I say, not as I do. And that's ultimately what's happening. And I think it's scaring a lot of investors and a lot of landlords and a lot of people that are thinking about entering that market because they don't know what new policies will come, because there will be new policies. These states are taking on a bunch of debt right now with the shutdowns, and someone's gonna have to pay for that debt. Someone's gonna have to pay. And the only really the only segment out there that could afford to pay or that could have money that they could take from is property owners, investors, people that own property in those areas. Who else? The businesses are getting dramatically hit. Retail is getting crushed. Most businesses are deemed non-essential. So it's really, it looks like it's going to be strictly laid upon the landlord, and it'll be interesting to see how this all lays out. Number 6 is policy. And I think a really good story here would apply perfectly. So I had a tenant just a little while ago. And so when that tenant was evicted, we went through a legal process, and that eviction was drawn out for a very long time. It was almost 8 months with this tenant. And what this tenant did was called up a free legal network that represents tenants exclusively and got free representation. And my attorney was not free. My attorney actually cost me over $20,000 to evict this one tenant. And this tenant was rightfully evicted. And it just took forever. And ultimately, her attorney, the way that her attorney is set up was, okay, I'm gonna represent you for free, but I'm gonna get a little piece of that settlement. And that's what they do. It's like legal extortion. And it happens in LA, it happens in New York City. It's a good way for them to kind of take money from investors and landlords and people that own property in both of those locations. And the policy is getting worse, especially given what's happening right now with the shutdowns, because courts are closed in both areas. And the politicians are saying, you know, rent's not mandatory. You don't have to pay right now. You can, if you can't pay, don't pay. And what's ultimately happening is now these investors are stuck holding the bill and they can't evict their tenants. So they're forced to essentially issue them a free place to live and then come out of pocket to pay for it. Number 5 is crime. Los Angeles, New York City, these areas, they're defunding the police. They're telling you not to wear a mask. They're putting everybody out of work. I mean, we have 157 million Americans in the workforce. Over a third of them have filed for unemployment since March. This 14-day lockdown has now been 5.5 months, and by the end of this, who knows if it's another 4, 5, 6 months. And there will be a lot of people that are desperate for survival. And what do they do when they're desperate for survival? They do things they otherwise would never dream of doing. In addition, drug addictions pick up, and as that happens, people lose their clear frame of mind, and people relapse, and people have these issues. And then you have metro stations that are connecting all these good neighborhoods with kind of rough neighborhoods. So you have all these people that are these transients that hop on these metro stations, go to this new neighborhood, they do whatever they can do there to try to make some money, and then they go back on the metro and go to different neighborhoods. And it's making people wonder, well, if I were in the suburbs, I'd be away from the metro line, I'd be away from all these problems, and I could also live there for less money, and that might make more sense for me. And that is a big, big question that many people are asking in both LA and New York City. Number 4, jobs. People move to the city in the first place for work. Well, now with social distancing, people are unable to go to the office. And since they're not working from the office for the most part, they're working from home. And that home could be anywhere. It could be in the city, it could be in the suburbs for less money. And they are now wondering, well, does it make sense for me to leave since my job no longer requires me to be in the city? There's so many tech companies right now that are hiring people to work from home rather than going into the office, because for them it makes way more sense, and this is going to be the same for small and mid-sized businesses as well, is the biggest expense they have is their lease. That big lease space that they have with the utilities and everything else is now optional. So if they can run their business from home and have these people go from home and then maybe do like a WeWork or some type of space like that where people come and go, that might make a lot more sense, and it might allow them to be more profitable and put their money back into advertising to grow and scale their business. And that seems more likely than taking out those expensive leases. So I think the requirement for people to be in the city is going to be less and less as we go forward. Number 3 is education. Parents know that schools are not going to reopen in the fall. So if they're at a high income bracket and they're sending their kid to private school, there's no need for them to send them to private school in the fall and pay the tuition because they're not going to school. So they ask themselves this question, well, I could save money if I move to the suburbs and put them in public school there, because public school in the suburbs is far superior than public school in the city. The city level education is below grade, to say the least. And this is not opinion, this is fact. And that's why many parents send their kids to private school in the first place in the city, because they don't want them to get the public school education. And the workforce is becoming so competitive that if they do not receive the best education, it's going to be really a handicap for them later on in life. And parents are asking themselves this question consistently: what can I do to help my kid? What can I do to help them gain an advantage later in life? Number 2 is land, privacy, and taxes. Taxes are much less. If you left New York City and went to Connecticut, your tax base would drop big time. And the same is true in LA. And you have land, you can have a nice yard, spend $200,000, $300,000, $400,000, get a beautiful little 3-bedroom, 2-bath house with a nice front yard, a nice back. You're not getting that in the city. In the city, you're going to be living on top of each other with common walls, hearing what your neighbor's eating for breakfast. Everything is going to be much better in the suburbs for a lot of people, and that's making people jump ship, go right to the suburbs. And the number 1 reason is the fear of the unknown. No one knows what's going to happen next. This year has been absolutely crazy for everybody. And I mean, we've had the sickness that's went around, we had the riots, we've had the looting and the vandalism, we have the mask on, we have the politicians that are making up all of these new laws as they kind of go along. And you have investors that are just scared. Education now is no longer at school. You have just a million and one reasons that take away the desirability of being in the city, as well as the taxes. Many people cannot afford the taxes in New York and LA. So people are literally moving in droves, and I think this trend is going to continue. And I would not be surprised to see a massive real estate crash in Q1 or Q2 of 2021. And the reason I say this is, if I were president right now and I had an election coming up in 2 months, would I want this economy to crash right before my election? No, I would not. I'd want to keep the economy in decent shape and then try to land this airplane right after elections like anyone. And that is what the president is asking right now. How can I land this plane safely? And right now we're still in the first wave. So that being said, we still have some time. I think Q1, Q2 of 2021 is going to start getting nasty and everything is going to start unraveling. But right now we're still having a big herd of buyers and investors and property owners leaving the city and going to the suburbs for a variety of reasons that I just mentioned, and many more reasons to come. So that being said, if you are an investor, you are a homeowner, you want to buy property, I have a free investing mini course for you. You just click the link and it'll direct you there. I suggest going through these videos because you'll learn a lot about real estate and real estate investing. And drop your comments below. I'll always respond to you guys. Hit the subscribe button. You will not regret it. And until next time, I'll see you guys soon.